Let's start at the beginning of it. You're a local boy, grew up in the area. Many people may not know. Tell us just a little bit about your upbringing and your family, because our families, for better or worse, shape who we are.
Mm-hmm. Grew up in Bedford Village, neighboring New York town. I won't tell you the exact years, but it was a place where I would call it a haven for my mother, who was ill, had a brain tumor, grew up with that.
So was she mobile and so forth, or?
She became very immobile over the years. It was a 20-year span where it started out with severe headaches and then went into a very crippling state. But as a teenager in Bedford, that was very difficult in a lot of ways. And I look back, and there's some things that I don't want to remember, and other things I remember that were important for me as I came to truly admire my father, who was an angel and stayed with my mother the entire time until she passed. And my dad was a corporate oil executive, New York commuting, 40 years. And I thought maybe someday I would follow in his steps and be one of those lifetime career people in one company. It didn't work out that way.
Before you tell us that story, if you don't mind, and the parts that were, as you think back in your mom, what were some good lessons you took from that? How do you think that shaped you, if that's not too hard to ask?
She was a woman of great wisdom, insights. She knew, she had no idea what the problem was, the medical issue, and they didn't know until after she'd passed. So she was living with something without knowing what it was. What I learned from her is her will to fight her way through this. And she probably studied as much as the doctors did by reading biochemistry books and prescribing her own medication, vitamins. I mean, I grew up earlier years on things like bone meal and unpolished rice and unrefined flour, and vitamin C and about 20 other vitamins. But that's the way I grew up, and I didn't know the difference, but she did, and she wanted to make sure that there was going to be a good life for the three of us. My twin sister, who you saw on the video here, and my older sister, who lives down in Truth or Consequences, New Mexico. Now, how many people have ever heard of that place? Been there.
You know, one of my favorite theologians, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, talks about that the strong need the weak. He inverts the logic. Many of us think if the weak need the strong, but the strong need the weak, to remind us of our dependence on God and to remind us of the hearts we should have. And it sounds like your mother gave you an amazing gift of kindness and compassion, which everyone who knows you sees in you.
Well, and it was a real test on a teenager to be a caretaker, one of three, and then we had some help, but if my mother was moved to go to the theater in the city, I would carry her.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. That's terrific. Well, thank you,
So,
Murph.
yeah, that's a bit about the family.
Yeah.
And we shared the responsibility.
Yeah.
It wasn't easy, and then we all got shipped off to schools.
Did you ever kind of get angry at God and throw stones at God, like, hello, this just isn't right? Like, how'd you process all that?
You know, I didn't know God well enough at the time to get angry. I didn't know who to be angry at. But I, as a child, went to church with my family, not necessarily at my will.
Sounds like we went to the same church.
Yeah. But I would attend. Had no idea what the Holy Trinity was all about. I knew there was a God just by virtue of listening enough to realize that there's a better reason for me to be there than what I wanted to be there for. But my faith came a little bit later on, and I'm happy to talk about that.
Yeah, let's loop back to that. So you graduate, you go off to work at CBS, didn't you? Your first job in New York City?
Right.
And then you got involved in management consulting, founded your own firm, as Holly said, ODI, and lived in Singapore. In fact, that's where you met your bride.
Actually,
wasn't that in Singapore or no?
I met her several years before then, my bride over here in the blue. And we went to Singapore together to build out the company. But just a quick little history there, because I went from CBS, where we closed our division at a $30 million loss at the time in 1969. Actually, it was, I take it back, 1971, and wrote it off. It was a $30 million loss with some gains that we had in Canada. But bumped into a professor of management at Boston University and realized that there was an opportunity to build something. He was a speaker at seminars for the New England Hospital Assembly, which had 400 hospitals throughout New England in their membership, and every one of his sessions were oversubscribed. So the whole point, the opportunity before us was to say, why should we wait once a year to go record a management seminar when we can video it and ship it out to all of the hospitals in the system? And the technology was just emerging back then. I mean, at CBS, we were the first electronic video recording process that plugged into a Motorola black box that was this big that played back pre-recorded programming on your home TV. And then Betamax. And
do you realize if you just said that to your grandchildren, they would have no idea what you're talking about?
Not a clue. Not a clue.
But really, you were breaking ground, weren't you? Technologically, marketing-wise. Well, today people might think, well, what's the big deal? That was exciting, bold new stuff. And you built this company out to be in Asia Pacific, Europe. I mean, just really an extraordinary deal.
We did, and the whole rationale was to build a system that you could actually market into hospitals at the time, because hospitals were very autocratic. Some of them are still very autocratic from the top down. And when the Taft-Hartley Act was amended to include hospitals to be unionized, the labor relations people jumped all over this, because what we built was a system that, based on Kurt Lewin, if you know Kurt Lewin at MIT at the time, talked about behavior as a function of the individual and the environment, and managers and leaders are the creators of the environment, if that makes sense. But, you know, the doctors back then would just say, in effect, shut up and do what I tell you to do.
Yeah.
And so our system invited participation, engagement, and problem solving, because when you get groups of people together to address problems, the outcome of that process is far better, greater than the single smartest person in the group. So it's the collective that will produce a higher value.
If I recall, Kurt Lewin developed, he was a social psychologist, and he developed a model called force field analysis, if I recall, where if you're trying to brainstorm a problem and solve something that seems insoluble in a larger cultural context, you draw up two lists of paper. One says what are the enabling forces and what are the opposing or resisting forces. And most people try to do more of what's already working. And his breakthrough is say, no, you need to do it the other way. Look at the resisting forces, the contrary forces, the headwinds. And if you can fix one of those, the net increase will be much more than doing 10% more of the others. So it sounds like you were, really at the cutting edge of that, Merv. With clients and things, particularly in international context, did you run into sort of cultural conflicts or things where you felt your ethics were ever tested in any ways?
The difficulty, we started out in the UK and built our organization out through partnerships throughout Europe. And the difficulty was when we got the European heads together, partners together in a meeting. It was chaotic because everybody had their own definition of certain words that we use, like.
So was it egos or was it language?
Ego.
Ego.
Yeah. I mean, the French, they were the first ones. I'd say it. No offense to anybody here, but not only do the French not like Americans, they don't even like each other. So we had. I'm sorry.
No, I love it. Carry on. Carry as you were. Carry on.
But the challenge was to get a group of very diverse leaders in Europe to focus on the outcome and the process. And they can use their own language to do that, but if they know what the outcome is intended to be, if they know what our objectives are at the time, then it makes it easier to reach the goals that we were set out to achieve.
Did you learn anything? Sometimes we learn, have great insights in places we don't think. Maybe it's on the playing field if we play sports, or maybe it's being in the orchestra and practicing an instrument. You were in the Marines for 3 years. You served, if I recall, not combat duty, but you served honorably. Did you learn anything there that became a life lesson or a skill that you found yourself using in the boardroom?
I did, and the reason why I joined the Marines is because I needed more structure at 18 years old.
And, so who here has any 18-year-old children?
And it was of my own accord that I did. Actually, it was when my roommate's brother came to visit my roommate, and he showed up in dress blues, and I said, well, there you go, I'm joining the Marines. And it's actually true. That wasn't the only reason, but the fact is that did get me into a place where there was a lot of structure. There was no room for deciding what I wanted to do. They decided what they wanted me to do. And if I can tell this story, it's like making love to a gorilla. You don't stop.
I don't know if we should tell the story, but go ahead.
You don't stop when you get tired.
Merv, I have done dozens, maybe hundreds of interviews, and I don't think I've ever heard that story. You don't stop until, okay. And now bring this back to how that helps us with a business lesson, Merv. That's precious.
So, structure, discipline, loyalty, courage, those are the things that are important in the Marines, and you'll never.
Again, structure, discipline, loyalty,
and courage. And that's drilled into every Marine that goes through, whether it's Parris Island or Quantico. And it's an experience that I had for 3 years in active duty. It wasn't some of that duty taxpayers would probably not be particularly happy with when you get shipped off to the Mediterranean for 8 months at the taxpayer's expense, and at that time it was like $10,000 per Marine over there. But yeah, Marine Corps was an experience I value, and it'll stay with me for a lifetime. I've built some very good relationships with other Marines who share those same values, and I think they're easily transferable back into family life and work life, where, you know, in the work life today, they talk about culture, which is too soft for a lot of CEOs today because they don't know how to measure culture. And you can't really, I would argue, manage what you can't measure. And culture is, I think, harder than the operational side of business because it's people and behavior. It's not what you do, but it's how you do what you do.
So things like loyalty, discipline, those are parts of people, courage, the very things structure you just mentioned. But tell me something, and you know, I don't know what the statistics are. Some of you would know, Wendy, Russ, I'm sure you would know than those in the search business. The number of positions and companies some will work for today might be whatever it is, 20 positions by the time we're 40 or something, 20 different companies. How would you advise a CEO who would bring you in to advise a company on the question of loyalty, bidirectional loyalty, the company to the employee to the company, when, gosh, no one seems to stay anywhere for any length of time, including executives?
Well, to me, it starts at the top. And the bird's eye view looking down should be connected and aligned with the worm's eye view looking up, because everybody looks up in organizations today. They all want to know, what's the boss doing? How is the boss behaving? And unless there's alignment across the top of the organization, you're not going to get alignment down into the organization. Work, I'll ask you the question, you know, which way do you think work flows, vertically or horizontally? Horizontally. It starts out there with the customers and the clients, and it travels horizontally through the organization. There are lots of connecting points in that process where trust doesn't exist, where accountability fails, where after 2 or 3 times of asking for something that you don't get, you finally lose trust. And morale goes down. And when morale goes down, people start to leave. And so trust is a critical part of, and accountability, because accountability produces trust. Without it, there's mistrust. And so that has to happen across the top. And it's sometimes very difficult because presidents of large divisions, CEOs of large divisions, $5, $10, $20 billion divisions have their own agendas. They got their own budgets. They're competing with each other. And to drive accountability, cross-functional accountability, I would call it, across the top, is a critical part of getting it driven into the organization.
Your career has just been an exciting one. You've done lots of marvelous things, and there's obviously hiccups along the way, but in general, you kind of went from strength to strength, it seemed. As you look back, do you wish you could have any mulligans, any do-overs where you bumped into an ethical situation, or in hindsight, you weren't really proud of a decision you made, for, let's say, from an ethical point of view or otherwise, whether in the business world or just life in general? Any mulligans you wish you could have?
I would argue that, I've had any number of mulligans. In retrospect, I've learned from others. It was Watson at IBM.
Not your dog.
No, not the dog. That called in one of his top managers who made a $10 million mistake.
Back then.
And he walked into his office and said, "Mr. Watson, I guess you're going to probably fire me." And Watson said, "Why would I do that? I just spent $10 million educating you." And so we learn from our mistakes. Everybody, a lot of people look at each other to see what is that person doing that I could be doing? What's that benchmark over there in another part of the organization that I could be learning from? What failures have I had that I could be learning from? And I've had my share. Nothing I think that pops out as, being an expensive failure. Maybe we went to Asia and opened up Asia a little prematurely. We thought that there was an opportunity there to build out a part of the world that, having built out Europe and to some extent the Middle East, we thought Asia would be a perfect opportunity. And it turned out to be a good opportunity.
But in a sense, that's not so much of a sort of an ethical lapse. It's just a business call that didn't play out, right. As opposed to that. You mentioned when we were chatting the other day, just thinking a bit about our conversation, that one regret you had to do with the church. Do you mind picking up on that?
Yeah,
you don't have to if you don't want to.
No, I'm happy to. Actually, I had a failed first marriage. At some point during my marriage, I was going to church, and the topic at the time was membership of the church. And when the pastor looked at me, because I didn't, for whatever reason, sign up to be a member of the church, the look I will never forget drove me away from the church. And I didn't go back for a number of years. And I regret that because I didn't, I allowed myself to, in a sense, be a victim of that circumstance. I didn't even bother to look for another church. And it wasn't until I met my wonderful wife, who led me to the Lord. Her parents were a huge influence on my life, and that was our 25 years of marriage now.
Terrific.
With a few years in between.
How about a little hoo-hoo on that? Yeah. Can a civilian get a Medal of Honor for this here? Is that possible?
I gave it to her last night.
Medal of Courage, badge of courage here.
Yeah. That's the award.
There you go. Good man, Nick. And as you think of it, since we're talking a bit about faith, some people are Bible scholars and students, and gosh, they know it cover to cover. As one of my friends says, they know it from Genesis to maps. Do you have any sort of favorite verses or stories or parables that just bring you comfort, or that you tap into now and then?
Well, I get one of those every day from my wife, because she's an avid interested and curious person when it comes to Scripture and the Bible. I did take a Bible course from beginning to end and probably forgot everything that was in between the beginning and the end. And so what I found out later on in life is that it's not about the history of the book, that it's about the essence of what Christ means in your life and the relationship that one and certainly myself has with Jesus Christ. So a verse, that stayed with me for a long time.
Let's just arrange that phrase, the essence, sort of understand the essence of the message. There's a Swiss theologian, still very highly regarded from the last century, called Karl Barth. Some of you may remember, and Karl Barth wrote, I think, 27-volume series called Church Dogmatics, and each is like about the size of a telephone book. And he was once asked, because he was so loquacious and long-winded, he was once asked, if you had to write on a postcard the essence, your word, the essence of what the gospel message is, what would you write? And without hesitating, he wrote down, this the Bible tells me so, the child's song. How does it go? I've got it back.
Jesus loves me.
Thank you. Here under the, thank you. Jesus, I can't, see, obviously I'm like Karl Barth, but Jesus loves me, yes I know, for the Bible tells me so. Thank you, Debbie. And that's what he wrote. That's the essence. Right. And that's what you've taken away.
And the essence, part of the essence for me comes out of one verse. I think it's Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. Did I get that right? Trust
Debbie,
in the Lord.
We're all looking to you to keep us honest, too.
Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. Acknowledge him in all ways, and he'll lead your path straight. So that has become the foundation of my belief. I do believe in the Holy Trinity. I used to think that if the Bible were nothing but fiction, it would be the greatest story ever told on earth. But it's a true story. And I've come to realize that it is a true story. And every day of my life, I try to become a little bolder in the way that I communicate my faith to others.
That verse in some ways is really appropriate for all of us here in the marketplace, the business world. Lean not on your own understanding. Wait a minute, we're all type A's and we're driven and we're trying to be smart and learn more and be at the top of our class, the top of our cohorts we're competing with. It's all about what I do to accomplish something. Yet that verse sort of inverts the power logic, doesn't it? And if we're achievers, which everyone is and in many ways perhaps should be, it challenges a certain humility that says, no, it's really not us that's in charge.
I heard this the other day in a Bible study. We have a once a week men's study, which is amazing. I mean, we build relationships in our study that are lasting. But the analogy or the metaphor was two individuals leaning on each other. And without the top part of the triangle, which is God, they could fall. And with God at the top, then they're really leaning into God, not into each other.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you. I want to ask you a question that sort of builds on this, because you referenced this men's group that you attend weekly. It's quite a commitment in our busy days. In my students down at Princeton, I ask 5 questions in this ethics course, and the 5th and final question, that's part of the final exam, is how do you stay ethically fresh? How do you stay ethically fresh? And by that I don't mean sort of sassy, but how do you stay on your game? Most of the people we see doing the perp walk or who are arrested for something or indicted, they're probably more or less good people. No better or worse, maybe even better than us here in this room. And yet somehow a series of things led them to a place where they made one or more ill-advised decisions. So how do you stay ethically fresh, Murph? And maybe to the extent it does, what role does your faith play in trying to stay on your game and not slip?
Well, I think at every decision point, you have to ask yourself some fundamental questions, like, is this the right thing to do? And if it is the right thing, am I doing it wrong or am I doing it right? So there's two different things there. And if you look at this in a quadrant, you can see the other quadrant is you could be doing the wrong thing, but you could be doing it perfectly right. And the worst thing you could do is to do the wrong thing wrong. That's just not a good place to be. But what's left in that upper right quadrant, right, I guess, for you over here, is doing the right thing right. And so just asking that question is sort of a checkpoint to see, is it ethical? If it is ethical, or if it's not ethical, it could be legal. And if it is legal and your gut tells you that you got away with something, it's probably not ethical. And so that's a question I think that has to be asked every time you get
actually
to that.
Consciously even ask yourself that question in certain situations.
Right.
Do you find, and I don't mean this is a leading question because it may not, but do you find your men's group is also a way that helps keep you connected to something bigger than yourself and ethics and leadership questions, or is that more detached from how you think about your work life?
No, it's very much connected. And Mike?
I think Dan will fix it if it's not. All right.
Good?
You're good.
And some of those gents are right here in the room. And so, thank you for showing up. We do have we spar.
You spar.
We have fun.
All right.
We learn. We have a leader, a facilitator. We have the book. And we strengthened I think our character by playing off of each other, understanding what our emotions are, our spiritual life is, where we've, fallen into dark holes and crawled out. Everything that we talk about is in strict confidence. In this men's group, we have about 16 or so people in the group. And I look forward to it every Thursday.
Let me pick up what a marvelous phrase, those of us who have fallen, myself included if I were in that group, us, who have fallen into a dark hole and somehow been pulled out. Because even if someone is a person of faith, whether Christian, Jewish, or whatever, that's not an inoculation, is it, from falling into dark holes? That even the finest people can, for a variety of reasons, find themselves in a really negative place. And you're very fortunate you've got these other dozen or so men to throw a rope in and pull you out and not smack you when you get to the top, but hug you and love you.
Well, and I want to make it clear, too, that this is not a group, a Christian club.
So what do you mean by that? I have a hunch, but go ahead.
We have Catholics. We invite, as we do here, people of all faiths and traditions. It's not where people have come from. It's a sharing opportunity and where we get to learn from each other, which I think is very important in this whole business of understanding what your faith is and measuring maybe that against other faiths and traditions.
Can everyone please turn the phones off before we start?
That's Karen, probably.
She just said, that was a dumb question. No, my anchor and bride. Go ahead. Yeah.
So-
This phrase "club" is interesting because I think, as I hear you, in one sense, you don't mean it's not a social club, but also it's not a Christian club of everyone who thinks the same way. So that you could have Catholic Christians, Protestant Christians, people who are on the road or journey, and that's a special thing.
We have, there are those who have experienced divorce, who may be going through a divorce, who may have family members that are of ill health, could be addiction of one sort or another, but these are men that I think are there because they really care. They
That's
care
true.
for each other.
You're fortunate. Do you mind if I, without using your name, tell my students that's one of the ways you keep ethically fresh?
Not at all.
All right,
Yeah.
all right. So one of the questions we're studying, which comes from this Bible, we're reading about the Volkswagen situation daily. If VW brought you in to say, Murph, well, they probably wouldn't call you that. They call you Herr Murphy. What guidance, we're in a bit of a hole right now. What guidance would you give us? What would be 2 or 3 pieces of wisdom you would share at their top board level to think about this very unfortunate situation they
Can I
find
take a
themselves in?
drink before? The new CEO is a gentleman, his name is Mueller, who took over after the 11 million Volkswagens were discovered as having irregularities with their emission cheating. And he has vowed to change the culture of the, I think, 600,000 employees around the world. And what little did I know, I thought Volkswagens were, the only product they made. It's the Hitler people's car for the average person. And there are actually 9 different automobiles. Did you know the Bugatti was one of Volkswagen's cars?
Porsche, Lamborghini.
All those. Seat, S-E-A-T. Yeah. So what would I advise them? First, I would try to get some data because I'd want to know a little bit about the culture. And by the way, they're trying to move from a highly centralized decision-making organization to pushing a lot of the authority and decisions out into the field, into the dealerships, into the regions. And that's a major shift. But I think there has to be an ethos at the top that is bought into by every senior executive responsible for the 600,000 employees. And you need data to move forward. You have to know.
So you get your data, and then what do you do once you have a sense of what the current situation is?
Then you have interventions with senior management, and you address accountability. If you've got 12 people across the top of the organization, and everybody unanimously agrees to what the CEO wants to do, but you don't see it, back into the organization, then there's a lack of accountability. So when people agree to do things, whatever it is that's decided, that's a covenant. That's an agreement, whether it's a handshake or whether it's a written agreement.
It's interesting you use the word covenant, which is a very religious word, this sense of a binding loyalty, back to your Marine principles, as opposed to a legal obligation. It's a binding loyalty. It's a powerful word. You talked about accountability. I'm going to ask you one more question. Then, as for those who are new, we open up to questions from folks, and we'll shift to that in one moment. But before I open up, I want to ask you one more question, and it picks up on what you would say to Volkswagen, and that's this question of accountability. If I recall, didn't you have a pastor once who asked all the parishioners in the church to write a chapter for a book you had done, and you were asked to write a chapter on
accountability.
Accountability.
And the author of the book is sitting back there, Chuck Davis.
Chuck, that's right. You had a pastor. There is a pastor.
And I think there are 17 chapters? 15 chapters representing 15 parishioners, 14. And, well, I hope you didn't exclude yourself. Oh, okay.
You wrote the Trinitarian approach. There you go.
Anyway.
So what was the thrust of what you wrote?
I wrote about accountability, and I led off with, what is accountability the way we think about it today? And oftentimes when, if any of you have had a boss in the past that has pointed his or her finger at you and said, I'm holding you accountable, it feels very tight around the neck. And so the definition that I think is much easier to swallow, if you will, is creating an environment in which people can count on each other. Creating an environment in which people can count on each other. And that travels through every part of the organization.
A lot of wisdom in that.
Yeah. And I think people have been tired of being told what to do, rather than negotiating, whatever the outcome is supposed to be, rather than the old sort of MBO, if you're familiar with management by objectives. That's the old shut up and do what I tell you to do. But today, what's far more important than MBO is building the relationship. Because without relationship, you're not going to reach your objectives.
That's wonderful. Well, Murph, thank you. Let's open up to questions. Who has something on their mind that Murph has commented on that you'd like to have him inquire further or explain further, or just something he hasn't spoken to that you'd like to ask him? Who's first? Yes, please.
Just speak on your last point about accountability. What kind of drove you and kind of motivated you to start, your writings about that, and in the culture of the working force right now, and then that you started writing about it.
So what motivated you to start thinking about and writing about accountability?
Right. I read a book on accountability from a West Coast firm, and I listened into seminars, and then I got caught up in the company and brought in as a CEO of the company. This is something I didn't talk about earlier. We were like north and south in our strategy for building the company, and so I walked out after a while. But a lot of the concepts came out of, I think, a very intuitive person who saw accountability as a major issue inside of organizations today. And I liked his approach. I was part of helping him develop that approach. And it stayed with me, because you look at companies like when I was working for CBS in New York, that was very hierarchical. And from the top down, it was just do what I tell you to do. And that's not an environment in which people, especially today, will hang around very long in.
Well put. Well put. Thank you. Another question. Yeah, Nick.
Murph, I was struck by when David asked you the question of what refreshes you ethically. And what I took away from that was the group, the power of the group, the community that you have in the 16 people. Now, the question is, did you have that along your path, or was it from top to bottom or horizontal where there was more sharing? And if there is that sharing, there is the potential of things getting out of control. So usually a leader has to kind of step in and give it some structure. But I was struck by, you know, the great opportunity you have with your group to be yourself, be real, but yet also invite feedback. So I'd just like you to elaborate.
And just to paraphrase, if you didn't hear, and I think there's essentially two parts. Did you have this group earlier in your life, your whole life, your career, or is that more of a more recent piece? And secondly, small group dynamics can be complicated. They can be dysfunctional. And how has your group, it sounds very functional, if I can put it that way, full of trust. How did that come to be, if that's a paraphrase? What would you say?
Well, you have to build trust within the group, and that's not an overnight thing. You do that through building relationships. Relationships evolve through one's curiosity about other people, asking questions that people will feel comfortable answering. And over time, it produces a bonding and shared reasons or rationale for staying together. And I think especially today inside of organizations, because group dynamics can be very challenging, especially in working across different cultures. You've got different decades of employees today that are learning how to adapt to this work environment. And some find it very difficult because they're in it for themselves. They think they have the answers, and yet all the research points to, you know, the value of the outcome is far greater when you've got a group, you know, together addressing and solving problems.
That's terrific. Thank you. Yes, please.
Thanks, David. Dick, thank you for your candor, and thank you for telling us a little bit more about your story.
Yeah.
And we had a chance to have dinner last month with our mutual friend Bill, and
Right.
kind of got to know you a little bit and a lot deeper today, and I really appreciate that. Two questions.
Yeah.
You've talked about your group on a weekly basis. I'm curious on what you do on a daily basis to stay close to your God. And the second and more important question is, how's your twin sister?
Oh,
She was going into
Yeah.
surgery the next morning, if
Right,
you remember. So
right.
please answer the second question.
no, she came out of it fine. She had a
Good stuff.
double mastectomy and has gotten through it, and thanks for asking. Yeah. And back to your first question.
For those who didn't hear, that was any daily disciplines and habits in addition to your weekly group?
Yeah, by the way, habits, that's an important word because that actually falls out of this whole business of accountability. Habits are not easy to change. And there needs to be a rationale for people to change old habits. But they will change old habits, I believe, when they pay daily attention to the things that do keep them ethically fresh. And when you understand the rationale, then you can swap out the old habits for new habits. And my wife helps me
She's your
with that every day.
You know, I brought this with me as a prop. Some of you may know Oswald Chambers' My Utmost for His Highest, and it has daily readings. And you might remember about a couple, 3 years ago, you went through a major health scare, and we weren't quite sure if you were going to come out of it. And I came and visited a few times, and we read some things from this, and it's something that many people also find as a discipline that's helpful. And by the way, we're glad you came out of it.
So am I.
Yeah, please.
nieces and nephews, and we're always thinking about the next generation, particularly kids from 20 to 30, who really, I think, have a different viewpoint on ethics than we might. So, how would you, make suggestions to our age to then filter down to their age in terms of educating, and if it's not just by example, what other ways would you have us consider for them?
Wow. To paraphrase, Cindy's question was having 5 nieces and nephews. As it happens, we do as well, so that makes me smile. Sometimes there's a different sense of what's ethical with the so-called millennial generation and those coming behind. Their sense of true north and what is negotiable or not negotiable is frankly a bit different from the greatest generation, keeping with our theme of Veterans Day. What advice would you have to aunts, uncles, parents, grandparents who are trying to meet these wonderful young folks where they are, but also to instill some values?
I think the first thing I would do is not try to tell them what ethics are. Ask them if they even have a sense of what it means. Engage in a conversation, use examples. It is a challenge with, I've got an 8, 9, and 11-year-old grandson, and I'm still trying to break into the relationship where we can even talk about the same language. I mean, it is a challenge, but I go back to the gorilla. Sorry.
Everyone's going to forget Proverbs. They're going to, but we. Let me maybe on that light note, but special note, draw us to a close. And as is now our custom in our new facility, for those of you who have come here for the first time, we'll have some pizza and drinks still available for a while to visit. But Murph, I want to thank you. And I heard you say several things, and as much as I know you and was looking forward to the privilege of interviewing you as a friend, I learned many new things tonight, even of all the other things you've helped and coached me with, and I thank you for that. How about we give Murph a round of applause? You're not done yet. You're not done yet. So Murph and Wendy came down to speak to my students last year, and we did sort of speed dating. They moved around tables in small groups and spent about 15 minutes each, and they would go to another group of the students and talk. And I just walked around and eavesdropped. I didn't orchestrate it. I was just in the background. And these are some of the smartest young minds in the world. And they were hanging on every word that the Murph was saying, hanging on every word. And you modeled an empathy and a gentleness, but also a depth of wisdom, which I thank you for. Sometimes when I wrap us up, I just say, have a good evening, and sometimes I feel inspired or led to close this with a benediction of sorts, and I feel in that mood tonight, if that's all right. May you all go out into the world, your place of work, with discipline, with structure, with loyalty, and with integrity, in the name of your Lord and those who you trust. Amen. Amen. Thank you, Murph.